Hello, everyone. Welcome today to today's webinar. So with us today, we have Professor Marcus Milwright, who is a British Academy Global Professor in the Department of History of Art at the University of York, and also has another role and was a Professor of Islamic Art and Archaeology at the University of Victoria in Canada. His research focuses on the art and archaeology of the Islamic Middle East, labor and craft practices in the urban environment, and cross-cultural contacts in the medieval Mediterranean. He's involved in archaeological and architectural projects in Jordan, Syria, Greece, and has created the crafts of Syria, crafts of Iraq, and Talking About websites. So there's 3 series of websites. His books include An Introduction to Islamic Archaeology, published in 2010, The Dome of the Rock, and its Umayyad Mosaic Inscriptions, published in 2016. Next one, focusing again on the craft side of things, so Islamic Arts and Crafts, an anthology in 2017. The Queen of Sheba's Gift, a history of the true balsam of Materia, I hope I pronounced that right, published in 2021, and a co-edited volume, book, Made for the Eye of One Who Sees, Canadian Contributions to the Study of Islamic Art and Archaeology. And I know this talk today will feature references to that last book, published in 2022. So thank you very much. There'll be questions at the end. You're welcome to add any in the chat that arise. And for the time being, I'm going to hand over to Professor Milwright. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll share my screen and we'll get going. Right. So it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you today. And what I want to do is first, perhaps just, as Francis was saying, I have at the moment sort of 2 appointments. And so my home university is the University of Victoria, where I've been since 2002. But I have this rare opportunity at the moment to devote myself to research for the next few years. And again, have the great privilege to be in the beautiful city of York and immerse myself in all the wonderful medieval architecture and other delights that are available there. So before I start, I mean, I'd like, as you know, I'm here in Toronto to acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississauga of the Credit First Nations, and also to say, of course, from my home department in Victoria, we always reflect on the great privilege of living on the ancestral territories of the WSÁNEĆ and other native peoples there. So this, I think, sort of brings me around to, what I'd like to talk about today, which is, as you can see from the title, the Canadian contribution to the understanding of the art, architecture, and archaeology of the Islamic world. And this is something which, became something I needed to think about much more when I came to Canada in 2002. And it's become sort of more pertinent both as the field has grown, across Canada, both in terms of museum and university appointments. It's being taught, these areas are being taught in so many more places. But also, I think that, when we look at, the instability that has featured in so many regions of the Islamic world, and particularly in the Middle East, since the Arab Spring and the emergence of a number of conflicts. These are things which have had a very serious impact on the cultural heritage of these regions. So not just the art and architecture of the Islamic period, but also, of course, of ancient sites which have been subject of destruction. So I think that it means that apart from this being a subject which is worth looking at in its own right, it's also something which I think we have a kind of moral responsibility to do what we can to record the this endangered heritage and then also make it sort of better understood around the world. So the the title that sort of this idea of contributions to the study of Islamic art and architecture and archaeology is a central focus, obviously, of the book that Francis mentioned, Made for the Eye of One Who Sees, Canadian Contributions to the Study of Islamic Art and Archaeology. And this is a book which had its origins considerably before when it was published, and some of those delays I will take ownership of as the editor of the book. These are often time-consuming projects, and the contributors were immensely patient as this came together. But the notion of doing this really sort of came about in about 2011, and it was just as we saw the beginnings of the Syrian civil war, and it was to think about sort of well, what is that Canadian role, and also to try and bring to the fore that there was this long history of engaging with Islamic material culture. So I wanted to try and bring together emerging and established scholars and curators across the country, as well as people who were working outside of the country who were born in Canada. Now, the thing is that if you tried to make a similar volume 20 years ago, there would have been very few appointments. And indeed, if we look at the sort of history of the study of these fields outside of, the Islamic world itself, then we would tend to think of research institutions in Britain, across Europe, and in the United States. Um, Now, the thing is that that's not to say that things weren't going on in other places, but the volume of activity was much less, and perhaps people weren't looking to places like Canada as centres for innovative new research, and I would argue that certainly is not the case now. It's a very vibrant field, and of course, when we look at earlier periods, we have these trailblazing scholars. Who made really significant contributions, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about the book, and then think about the history of Islamic art and architectural scholarship, as well as the history of collecting and curating in Canada, the sort of early development of that, and tie that in with what the book is trying to do. And then in the last part, I'm going to just sort of look at how objects which actually are in Canadian, in this case, private collections, can generate really interesting research. And this is, I'm just going to share some research I've been doing recently, and how that then spreads out into looking at objects from other places. And, hopefully, it shows how art historical research on sort of old objects can still have a contemporary resonance. So as you can see from the list of contributors, we have many of the best known names in the study of art and archaeology in Canada, and we were extremely fortunate both to have McGill Queen's Press taking on the project, but then also in the latter stages the support of the Royal Ontario Museum, who generously co-published the book. And this was done, I particularly like to acknowledge Famida Suleiman, who is the curator of Islamic art now at the Royal Ontario Museum, for her support. And one of the things that they were able to do was to have an opening section of the book, which is treasures from the Royal Ontario Museum, and in beautiful full color. You have objects dating from the earliest phases of Islam right through to the work of contemporary craftspeople and artists across the Islamic world. And I think it really shows, you know, that again, we're not dealing with something which is a sort of static or a dead tradition, but something which is constantly changing and often, you know, sort of using traditional techniques in order to reflect on more contemporary realities. One lovely example of that is what's called an ikat textile, where the threads are actually dyed before they're woven, and so you get the patterns kind of emerging within this woven textile, and it's used for making a coat. And on the back of it, you have the images of Darth Vader's helmet, you know, sort of repeated, you know, through this very ancient decorative technique. So the scope of research which is being done by Canadian scholars and then also non-Canadians who are based in institutions across the country is very considerable. So the map that you can see here doesn't encompass all of what's going on, but it does give at least a flavour of the key locations which are mentioned in the book itself. But you know, we could add to that that there are interesting areas of research in Greece, in the Balkans, as well as sort of looking at things like Islamic objects appearing in other parts of the world, you know, in China, in Ukraine, and so on. There's also historiographic research looking at, you know, the history of collecting, and we'll come back to that later on. So this gives, you know, some sort of sense of that, and one of the other, I think, really important things is that we do see an equal representation of what we can call art historical or architectural history scholarship and archaeological scholarship. When we think of archaeology, obviously we think of excavating sites, but it can take on other characteristics as well. But I think the key distinction, perhaps for the moment, is that archaeology encompasses the broadest range of human interactions with the natural world and the making of things, where art history is perhaps more privileging a smaller group of objects for their, you know, aesthetic iconographic concerns, so that this equal emphasis is something that we see in teaching across Canada, as well as right back to the earliest times of collecting in museum context as well, particularly obviously in the Royal Ontario Museum. So one of the, you know, key things is obviously that Canada is blessed to have, you know, two world-class collections of Islamic objects. One of them in the Royal Ontario Museum, first conceived in about 1905, sort of founded in 1912, and then opened to the public in 2014. And then, as you can see, a museum which has changed over time, particularly with the addition of the crystal in 2007. And it's indeed in that part of the building now that the Islamic collections are primarily showed. It's also a place for looking at contemporary art, and at the moment there is a really wonderful exhibition of contemporary art by female Muslim artists. And then in addition, you have opened in 2014 the Aga Khan Museum, featuring the collection of Prince Sadruddin and other members of the Aga Khan family. And this is again an extraordinary collection. I was actually there today and reminding myself of you know, the treasures that they hold, and also a really interesting collection in that it's not just about objects, but about thinking about them in a contemporary context as well, so that it is right from its foundation has always featured the historical collection with contemporary art objects. So at the moment, the end of the main gallery containing the historical objects has a beautiful paper and fabric construction based around the idea of the Tower of Babel by a Syrian artist. And then upstairs, there's a whole additional exhibition based on collaboration of an author and an artist with textile art and installations and so on. So I think that, again, it creates impression of the relationship between these historic traditions and artists working in the contemporary. The sculpture by Parvis Tanavali, a Persian-Canadian artist with an international reputation. This is one of his Heech sculptures, which sort of is inspired, as you can see, by sort of calligraphic forms as well as sort of ancient art within Iran. So we have these collections, but of course, around the country, there are sort of many other examples of smaller collections of Islamic art. And I think one of the things in future would be to try and bring these together and actually have a more comprehensive list of the collections that exist. We have a really important in the Special Collections Library in McGill. There are objects in UBC's Museum of Anthropology in Victoria. I know that the Nickel Collection in Calgary also has a major collection of carpets. But again, there are many other things out there, which, again, I think for the purposes of future scholarship, it would be good to have a sort of comprehensive listing. I think one of the interesting things as well is that there is a sort of early history of collecting, and we can see it in the Royal Ontario Museum from the late 19th century onwards, or things that ended up there. And that actually predates the building of the first official, or, sort of formal mosque within Canada. And I'm showing the picture here of the Al Rashid Mosque in Edmonton, which was completed in 1938. And that was built largely through the instigation of the Lebanese Muslim community in the city. This was led by Hilwi Hamdan, who I was reading in the Canadian Encyclopedia. She was described as irrepressible. She obviously had a real gift for bringing together the different communities in the city, and is a wonderful example of a kind of sort of ecumenical project which led to the creation of this mosque. So we could see that, from the foundation of the Royal Ontario Museum, Islamic art was a major component of that. And when we think about that, it obviously kind of had a sort of a for history, sort of something, things were happening beforehand, and thought about what it was they wanted that museum to do. So if we go right back to the 1830s, there were already discussions about creating a provincial museum in Toronto. But by the time you get to the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, that the vision is to create something which, sort of has not just a sort of national one, so that this would encompass both the art history, the geological aspects, all sorts of other kind of subject areas. But in terms of the art and archaeology, and indeed, it was founded as the Royal Ontario Museum of Art and Archaeology, is that it was meant to look at the world, world cultures, with the Islamic world and also the sort of pre-Islamic Middle East being a very major part of that. And you can see here, some of the pictures from early exhibitions, and it's a wonderful example showing, how curatorial practice changes over time. and this also reflects different understandings of what Islamic art is meant to be, and how we would define it. And here we have one of the sort of early important exhibitions at the Aga Khan Museum, which really took on in a very direct way the cultural heritage of Syria in the context of the ongoing civil war. And this was also connected to a conference which actually looked at Syrian culture, running right from the earliest phases of human history through to Syrian television. As some of the last lectures are on fascinating aspects of contemporary culture. Interestingly curated in that it wasn't a strictly chronological progression, but rather was looking through for connections through time. So there are examples of a beautiful 6th century silver vessel with images of saints around it, and then exactly the same vessel form on a 13th century inlaid brass object made in the same region, showing sort of again these huge continuities of craft practice, and then including the work of modernist artists such as Fateh Modares, as you can see down in the lower part of the screen. So if we think about this world of collecting, there are many people one could identify, but in terms of the story of the creation of the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum, which remains with the Aga Khan, we can focus this around the man you can see in the center of the screen. This is Charles Trick Curley. And he was trained in theology, had a strong interest in the Middle East. And fortuitously, he met in the British Museum William Flinders Petrie. And Petrie, of course, is a great Egyptologist. And after that conversation, Petrie took the young Curley on as an assistant, and then he went out on excavations in Egypt with Petrie. And I think it's this sort of experience that led him to think about the world of collecting, and this comes at a very important time because the person who was trying to get a museum started was Sir Edmund Walker, who you see on the portrait on the screen. And it was Walker who I think he'd initially sort of thought it was going to be too expensive to try and collect on the level that was going to be needed to create a museum. And Curley was able to show him that he could buy things in the Middle East rather than buying them from dealers in places like Britain and the States at a much cheaper prices. And so he demonstrated this by buying something that Walker already, an object that Walker already had a similar one at a much lower price in Cairo. Now, the thing is that this was a time which was the great growth of the antiquities market. So, from the probably 1870s onwards, but, really ramping up in the 1890s, early 1900s. This trade which was going on in what could broadly be called antiquities, but obviously goes from objects of great age that have been excavated from the ground through to things which would have existed within people's houses going back to kind of medieval times. Now, of course, if we see this from a contemporary perspective, there are all manner of ethical issues which would now not conform to the way in which we would expect curators to work. But Curley was very much working within the context of what was acceptable in the early part of the 20th century. And so he was buying very extensively from dealers in a place like Khan al Khalili that you can see on the screen here. And I've shown also an example of a dealer. Currently wasn't involved in Syria so much, but this is a wonderful stereoscopic photograph of a dealer in Souk al Hamadiyah in Damascus, and you can actually, if you look very closely at the image of the old gentleman, you can see it's just slight moving because it was obviously a fairly long exposure to actually get this wonderful image of this busy looking shop. And we have really interesting accounts, including there's an Arabic text called the Kamus Sasinat Shamiya, which is the Dictionary of Damascene Crafts, and this actually gives wonderful descriptions of the antiquji, and this is the Arabic name for an antiques dealer, and it talks about where they were getting objects from, and also that they were employing craftspeople to make copies as well, and some of which we might talk about as fakes or forgeries, but other ones were probably just simply things for the tourist market. So it's a very kind of active trade in genuine antiquities and reproductions at this time. And the thing is that Currely was by no means the only collector out there. You have also all manner of curators of major collections were going out to Egypt, also to Iran, India, and so on, and buying very extensively. And as well as those sort of professionals, you have sort of enthusiastic amateurs in a sense, and a wonderful example of that is what you can see on the screen here, which is Leighton House, and this is the house built by Frederick Lord Leighton, the great academic painter, and he had a fascination with Middle Eastern culture, and through intermediaries, he did travel in the Middle East himself, but through intermediaries, he bought a lot of tile work and other decorative elements from Egypt and Syria, to some extent from Iran, and then put them into this area, which is known as the Arab Hall, which is a sort of fantastical recreation of the type of architecture that we see in the 14th and 15th centuries in Syria, particularly. And where he couldn't, sometimes with the tiles, where there were missing bits, he commissioned artists in Britain, such as the great potter William de Morgan, to actually make reproductions to complete some of these designs, and also the beautiful turquoise tiles that you can see in the background by the staircase, again, were done by William de Morgan. So these are obviously not museum displays, but rather they are kind of imaginative reconstructions. And another example of that is Doris Duke's house Shangri-La, which is just outside of Honolulu in Hawaii. And here you can see that she again was buying very extensively. These are Persian tiles of the 14th century, and recent scholarship has been trying to identify which buildings these came from, because there was a massive trade in, sadly, tiles being torn out of religious structures and then sold on the art market. But what makes Duke particularly interesting is that she was very interested in the contemporary crafts as well. So she bought 19th and early 20th century material. Interestingly, on her travels, she met Gandhi and talked. Seems to have talked to him about, sort of craft in a general sense. And so we see a photograph here of the painted wooden ceiling that you can see in the sitting room here, and this was made in Morocco in the 1930s. But at the same time, she was buying, as other collectors did, entire rooms. So that the Damascus room that you can see is all painted woodwork that came out of an 18th century building in Damascus. So returning to the museum environment, one of the challenges that Islamic art, and this is, and we can see it in other kind of artistic traditions across the world, is that it didn't naturally fit into the kind of European derived idea of fine art, art which is made entirely for its own interest. And we then kind of think about the idea of the masterpiece and the singular art object, and then the bigger world of applied art and craft. Um, and if we think about this in an Islamic context, in Arabic literature, particularly, we see that there isn't really a clear distinction between art and craft. And even within the Persian tradition, you have to wait until the kind of 16th century before you start to see people writing about artists as named individuals. And so many objects that we're dealing with are things that have a practical function. I mean, it obviously doesn't stop them being beautiful, but we look at ceramics, and they are jugs and they're lamps and they're all sorts of things that do things, or they're carpets, as you can see, interior furnishings. And of course, for somebody trained in a Western tradition where you want to look at meaning, and you want to look at the biography of artists and so on, it's challenging, because it doesn't have a lot of the information you'd want to deal with. And one of the ways that museums sort of tried to cope with this problem, as you can see in the examples on the screen, is to appeal to this kind of European concept of the masterpiece. And so essentially to kind of co-opt a kind of European language to understand Islamic art. And the thing is that, it's quite comprehensible that one might do that, in that it allowed people to sort of see these things in and bring them up to notionally a sort of level that they were expecting with art, sort of we're talking about kind of an early 20th century audience here. But it obviously doesn't really make much sense, and it led to these exhibitions where things are kind of put together in a very incongruous way, sometimes rather ahistorically. And we still struggle with these things today, in that we have objects, and I've chosen obviously a piece from the Aga Khan Museum here, the extraordinary manuscript painting from the Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp, showing the court of Gayamaz, the mythical first king of Iran. And this is a painting that you can, if you have a chance to see it in reality, you can go closer and closer and closer, and it keeps revealing more detail within it. It is a breathtaking object. Of course, part of a much larger set of illustrations for the book itself. So some things are singular, they're made for a particular individual, and sometimes we even know the names of the people who made them. But other things, are like this. They again are things that have a beauty in their own right, but they might in other contexts be in an ethnographic museum. And so, there's a sort of porous boundary between art and craft, which I find a very kind of dynamic and interesting aspect of the discipline. So I think that when we look at the Royal Ontario Museum, it privileges archaeology from an early stage, and we can also see it in the hiring of key curatorial figures. So on the screen you can see A. Douglas Tushingham, his wife Margaret, and they traveled very extensively and excavated a number of sites. They were active in Jerusalem, in Theban, in Jordan, and a number of other very important early sites. And a lot of that material then found its way back to the Royal Ontario Museum and remains, very important for scholarship through to today. Under Edward Keel, also you have the excavations at Zabid in Yemen, and the publication of that is continuing. But again, you can see that it sort of encompasses both architecture and urban planning, but also the excavation of objects, and just this wide world of material culture, things like hydraulic engineering, all manner of things which are not necessarily part of the conventional art sort of mandate of art history. So there's that side of it, and then of course there's the curation of these collections, and that itself is a challenge, because it spans so many different areas, and we have sort of you're seeing on screen two of the chief curators, Lise Gollenbeck and now Fahmida Suleiman. And it requires levels of specialization where you've got manuscripts, you've got ceramics, you've got metalwork, textiles. One of the largest collections of inscribed textiles, what are called terras, anywhere in the world. I think only Egypt has more material than the Royal Ontario Museum. But we also see branching out, as Fahmida Suleiman has been doing, into contemporary art. And so again, if you have the chance to go to the Royal Ontario Museum, there's a wonderful exhibition of work by contemporary female artists, such as this pair of shoes that's made out of razor blades. So dealing with some really important issues. So just very briefly, I'll mention the types of areas that the book deals with, and it looks at architecture. And so I'm showing you just two examples from the book. One, the facade of Moshatta, an 8th century palace in Jordan, which itself has a very interesting history. In Gertrude Bell in 1902. It was in situ in just outside of Amman, and you can see it in her photograph. But it was given, the whole facade was given as a gift by the Ottoman Sultan to Kaiser Wilhelm following his visit in 1906. And now the facade is in the Museum for Islamic Art in Berlin. So, all sorts of interesting kind of political issues that one can look at in terms of the history of archaeology. And on the other images, you can see the extraordinary Wazir Khan mosque in Lahore, and this was studied by Erica Dodd, who has devoted much of her career to looking at Quranic inscriptions and the function of inscriptions in general in architecture. And she wrote about the Quranic inscriptions, the poetry, the hadith, in other sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which adorn this building. And where in say a Christian religious building you'd expect to see images of Christ and the saints and so on, here it's text which is doing that same work and creating this encompassing experience both on the exterior facade and then as you go inside the building. There's a lot of consideration of the kind of broader world of material or popular culture as well. So Parvis Tanavali, apart from his work as a sculptor, he's also a collector and scholar of Islamic art. And here he provided a wonderful chapter about these strange stone lions, which are a feature of 17th century culture in Isfahan and surrounding areas. We see also a more recent object, a talismanic shirt from Burkina Faso, where the idea is that the texts and the sort of somewhat amuletic designs on here are things that will actually protect the body of the wearer. And this is something, there's a long tradition of this, at least going back to the 15th century or so. And at the mundane end of things, drain pipes. So something that we don't tend to think about too much, and yet a vital aspect of architectural projects, right through to the present day. You build these things before you create the structures that go on top, and yet these major industries through the medieval period have received relatively little attention. And then, of course, we have, the more conventional world, or more sort of expected world of art history, ranging from Fahmida Suleiman's contribution on Fatimid luster. So this is a very specialized form of glazed pottery in the Islamic world. And we see giraffes here, and this is what she's interested in, through to manuscript painting. And then Mark Antliff, a Canadian scholar who is based in the States, looking at the influence of Islamic art and aesthetics on the painting of Matisse, who traveled to North Africa and was absolutely entranced by what he found there. So just for the last few minutes, I'll show you sort of an example of an object that exists, sort of I came into contact with in Victoria, and just some of the ways in which it can kind of move on to think about um, Islamic art research and how it can draw in objects from other places as well. So I'm going to show you two separate examples. So this one was brought into me by a gentleman in Victoria, and it was it was bought by his father in France, and what you actually have here is a box that's made out of two spent artillery shell cases, probably from a howitzer, sort of from a cannon, and they are dated. Or at least one of the shells is dated because it still has its original manufacturing date of 1911, and the other markings allow us to identify it as having been made in a German factory in the Ruhr Valley. But it's also got packed onto the surface the word Damascus, and then also a date of 919. Now, whether this was supposed to be 1919 or something else is not really very clear. But what we have here is something made in Damascus, and we can trace this as being a craft which is associated with the Jewish community in Damascus. Now, that community has almost disappeared, and most of the Damascene Jews have moved to other places. But they were specialists in metalworking, and there were still workshops up into the 1980s run by Damascene Jews. And they made these sort of inlaid metal vessels. You can see another example here, which is dated and is associated with the capture of Damascus from Ottoman troops in 1918. And you can see images of Lawrence of Arabia and also the Australian light infantry, who are actually cavalry, sorry, who were the first to actually go into the city. And so soldiers were buying these as mementos and then taking them home with them. But we see how a modern object here has a whole sort of, even though it's an assertively modern thing, it's making use of very traditional techniques, the inlay, and then also the patterning on here again is things that we can trace back into the 19th and much earlier. And it's part of a kind of much bigger tradition of making what's called Mamluk revival metalwork. And this is in the late 19th into the 20th century, the practice of making copies of earlier types of metalwork, particularly of the 14th century, which is a sort of high point under a dynasty called the Mamluks, who ruled between 1250 and 1517. So in places like Cairo, Jerusalem, Damascus, there were craftspeople making these Mamluk revival objects. Some of them are very, very close copies of original pieces. So that the cabinet you can see here is actually based on a piece which is in the Islamic Art Museum in Cairo and actually has the name of a sultan, Nasser Muhammad ibn Kalaun, and the date of 1329, I think it is. And these were kind of rather slavishly copied, but then gradually they become less and less like the prototype and they start to develop a life of their own, often with the inscriptions. So we can see the top of a Mamluk revival uh, version, which is in the Azam Palace in Damascus. But you can see how the central part of this is then taken by other metal workers and then placed onto new objects such as trays and boxes here. So it becomes a sort of dynamic tradition over time. And we can link this up to changes which are happening in the craft environment in places like Damascus and other parts of the Middle East in the late 19th, early 20th century. So there aren't mechanized factories for making things in the Middle East at that time, or very few. And at the same time, you've got this sort of hand industry going on, but they're having to compete with particularly goods which are coming from Europe. So sort of textiles which are coming from Britain and other France and so on, glazed ceramics. Coming from southern France and from Dresden, and then also high quality Bohemian glass. And the effect of this is that it was driving some of these traditional crafts out of business, and other ones were just having to adapt to this new environment. And we see that in photographic evidence, we see it in described in travelers' accounts, and then also in the Kamus Sinat Shamia, this Arabic text about the crafts of Damascus. So it's a world which is changing, and we're seeing elements of the past and then new items coming into it as well. And the other, of course, element is warfare, and we see the First World War is, of course, really the first mechanized war, both across the world and obviously in the Middle East itself, and it leads to the creation of new art. These are the beautiful paintings by the Carline brothers. They were official war artists, and they were sent to the Mesopotamian campaign, and they created, among the first sort of aerial paintings, as you can see here, looking down onto cities and landscape in general, and it really is again sort of very distinctly modern in terms of the subject matter and the viewpoint. But what I want to just do just quickly is show you some of the more unexpected kind of aspects of this. And I'll try and be brief because I don't want to go over time. But this is an object which I was curating an exhibition on the art of the First World War in 2014 for the 100th anniversary. And I was going through UVic's, University of Victoria's library, and I came across this book, which is interesting in itself. It's a 2-volume account of the Mesopotamian campaign that was written in 1919. But the reason why I'm showing it to you now is because it was owned by a soldier who'd actually taken part in the campaign itself, and he writes corrections into it. For instance, in some of the battles he was involved with, but he pastes into it sort of texts as well. This one is a poem. Now, whether it's his own poem, it's not a great piece of literature by any means, but whether it was his own poem or he heard it from someone else is unclear. But there's no other copy of this, but he also includes a typewritten poem called the Mesopotamian Alphabet, and this ended up being published in one of the trench newspapers, the ones that were done on the Western Front. I think it was actually in the Wipers Times. And so, again, whether he wrote it or whether it was somebody else, we don't really know. But on the world of sort of art and archaeology, there's a fascinating document which you can see here, which is he added this page into the text and then pasted onto it these two photographs. And as he says in the handwritten notes, they were spoiled photographs which he took from the German aviation office in Tikrit when they took the city in 1917. And what we see here are the one at the bottom. It looks as like a creased piece of paper, but in fact, all these creases are the lines of trenches with the crow step pattern that they were typically given. And I haven't been able to identify exactly where this is, but it seems to be in a place called Istabalat, near sort of at the southern end of Samarra on the Tigris River, because the one above it, which I'll show you um, in a greater detail, what this actually shows is the curve of the Tigris River at the bottom, and then the walled town of Samarra here. The walls are added in the 19th century. But beyond it, you maybe can just make out these sort of ghostly forms. And these are elements of the great 9th century city of Samarra, which is arguably the largest archaeological site in the world. And quite by accident, these photographs ended up being pasted in a book that had been forgotten in University of Victoria Library. And these are among the earliest aerial photographs to survive from the city. So this shows again sort of elements of that 9th century city, and its importance in Islamic art is that it it contains some of the most innovative art of the early Islamic period, including the luster ceramics and then the decorated stucco that you can see on the walls of some of these ruined palaces. So a very last example, and this sort of follows up on that First World War in Iraq. This is actually from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's an engraved platter. It was conventionally dated to 25th of Muharram 1337, which equates to the 31st of October 1918, which is the Armistice Day. It was the Treaty of Mudros, and it shows a town called Hindia in the south of Iraq. Now, more recent scholarship has suggested actually the year that's on here is incorrect, and it should actually be equivalent to 1920. And what this does is it actually places it not at the end of the First World War, but during what was called the Iraq Revolt in 1920, which has a huge status in Iraqi culture because it's sort of essentially the beginnings of the modern state of Iraq. And what we see on this, very unusually, is again in a traditional style, and yet it's showing the modern world. It's showing, as you can see, British soldiers, armaments, cannon, machine guns, and so on, as well as biplanes. And I'm showing you some details here. So you have the feluccas, these sailed ships, as well as gulfas, little coracles that would be used for taking goods across the river, as well as very contemporary elements. The execution of a man called Sadiq Effendi, you can see in the other image, and then the British soldiers kind of surrounding it. So it seems to have a lot of political connotations, although it's not quite clear yet what these things mean. But as a result of looking at that one, it's now turned out that there are actually several others, and they all seem to be from the same series, and they show different days during the Iraq Revolt. So I'm showing you part of another example from a private collection, and it shows, these Iraqi or potentially Indian metal workers who are doing this, that they are really engaging with what things look like. The example of the Vickers gun you can see, as well as armored vehicles, and then biplanes bombing here. I mean, almost sort of shades of Picasso's Guernica here. So I think that these are really interesting objects because they actually show a sort of the beginnings of an engagement with the modern world through art, and it predates, the beginnings of kind of Iraqi modernism that we see in the sort of mid part of the 20th century. So just to conclude, I hope this has shown, some of the the depth and variety of scholarship across the Islamic world that's going on in Canada at the moment. And as the images you can see on the screen here, it does really encompass everything from, some of the very earliest inscriptions. This one, a Quranic inscription made by a man called Uthman ibn Wahran near Mecca, so this sort of epigraphic research, right up to the present day, where we see, curation and scholarship on artists who are operating now, and yet again still interested in this great calligraphic tradition. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Marcus. That's brilliant. That was a really interesting presentation, and many of those things are new to me, and I know many on the call maybe will be more familiar with some of those, some that you've actually referred to. Really engaging, incredible pictures. There's some art pieces there that I'm definitely going to go away and have a look at again. So particularly, I think one of the pictures where you said if you get really close, that would be something to actually see in an art gallery itself. So thank you so much. Just going to give a time to for everyone to think of questions just before we move to the question sessions. I'm just going to say this is recorded for the York in Canada group, the University of York, so it's an alumni group, and we're hosting a series of webinar talks, and thankfully Professor Mulwright has agreed to be our first speaker of the series. My name is Francis, and I coordinate the York in Canada group. Really interested to hear more of your thoughts and suggestions for future talks. So I'm now going to move to the question session. I am going to leave it recording for now. If you don't want your question on the recording, that's absolutely fine. I'll close the recording and we can continue to have a discussion there. Would anyone like to raise a question now? Okay, that's fine. So one of our guests has had to leave as well. So that's yeah, so that's brilliant. I'm gonna ask, I guess I'll ask maybe one question, a couple now, so they're on the recording. And then I think there are other questions that others will be keen to ask. I wanted to, what was quite interesting at one point, you mentioned that as sort of bohemian work and competing with European artifacts, artists tried to either went out of business or tried to adapt. So my question really is how did artists attempt to compete? Did they try to compete and change their style during that period of competition?
Yeah, I think it's a really kind of varied picture, and I've been working for some years on this dictionary of the crafts of Damascus, and there, you see how some entries they'll say, for instance, that one of them is the needle makers, and this used to be a craft of actually making needles by hand, for a variety of purposes. And then suddenly, there are factories in Europe that are producing these things for virtually nothing, and they simply cannot compete at all. Whereas in other cases, they adapt to local markets or adapt to doing something differently. So one of the crafts, the traditional way of smoking was to have a very long tobacco pipe, and so you'd have the clay bowl, and then you'd have this long wooden stem and then an amber mouthpiece. And there was a craft of boring out the stems and then decorating them in all sorts of lovely ways. And because people started taking up smoking cigarettes, they shift to making cigarette holders instead. And so, they're making something to adapt to new tastes, or there were kind of local ways of doing things, local ways of cooking. And so if you were making the kind of cooking pots and serving things that were needed for that, they weren't being made by European markets. But I think that, you do see new art being produced, because there is an increasing tourist market. And so you get inlaid metal work and painting and various other things that is trying to adapt to the tastes of wealthy North Americans and Europeans who are coming on their, sort of package holidays to the Middle East. And so it's some things remain the same, other things kind of change, and that's why I think again these objects I showed at the end, I think they're really important in terms of create. There's a new aesthetic being developed there, and it's possible that those objects are being made for a British client, although that's not quite clear yet. But the idea that instead of relying on things like calligraphy, geometric patterns, and so on, you're actually looking at what's going on around you, and the weaponry that's there, the uniforms that people are wearing, and things like this. That's a very different way of producing art. So it's I think it deserves more attention.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to close the recording now. We will continue the discussion session.